Hello and welcome to my presentation. Today I'll be talking about the difficulty of video games and its effect on accessibility for my final project. This is the overview of what I'll be talking about in my presentation. First of all, I'll be talking about what difficulty is and how it affects accessibility generally in video games. Second of all, I'll be talking about the evolution of difficulty in video games, starting from arcade games and early home consoles to the next generation consoles such as the Nintendo Switch, PS5, and the Xbox Series X. And then I'll be talking about what difficulty is in competitive or multiplayer games. And then I'll be talking about the difficulty in speedrunning games. And finally, I'll have a friend who has played Elden Ring recently talk about how difficult Elden Ring is from his point of view. So when someone asks what video game difficulty is, they usually say it's pretty much how hard a game is or how hard to complete a game. Well, that's pretty much true, but I wanted to look further into an actual definition, and I came across an article from MakeUseOf.com saying that it's a measure of which a game fairly challenges the player relative to their skill level, and in turn allows the player to be more engaged in the game by manipulating the parameters. And the parameters can range from enemy health, damage, enemy spawn frequency, player damage, frequency of items, adding or removing some game mechanics, or increasing or decreasing reaction window time. When it comes to accessibility in video games, it's a measurement of how a video game can be played by a diverse community of players, and players come in any form basically, from just regular players to players who may suffer from a disability such as colorblindness or epilepsy. And game developers over the years have made games more accessible by allowing subtitle text sizes, for example, to be larger, or they can make colorblind settings, or they can tweak colorblind settings to allow players who have a colorblind disability to be able to play the game. And even recently, such as in Forza Horizon 5, in this image, the game speed can be decreased, which allows players who would suffer from a reaction time to be able to play the game without needing to have a quick reaction time. And within accessibility is the difficulty of video game, and difficulty can often steer a player away or towards a video game. And sometimes, even if the game is too hard, it may limit the playability to a certain skill level for certain players. In order to understand where video game difficulty came from and its evolution over time, we should start talking about arcade games. According to Ranker.com, arcade games were the first form of video games, and it started around the 1980s. And although at first glance these games looked easy, with most of the games being in 2 dimensions, they were hard to master as games were based on a high score system. The game started easily first with the player being able to quickly figure out the controls. However, as the levels progressed, they were exponentially made harder using more enemies, enemy attack frequency, or enemy speed, but the player generally only had 1 life or chance. This was done so that the players would keep feeding in quarters to try again and progress further into the game so that the developers could profit more. Arcade games are few but still around today, and many people have started using emulation as a way to cheaply gain access to play these games. Over time, as video game technology advanced, consoles were introduced to homes so that people did not need to go to arcade centers to play video games. According to HowToGeek.com, early home consoles started around the 1970s, but were most popular around the 1980s to 1990s. Most of the games were similar to the arcade in that they were level-based and usually consisted of 1 or a couple of lives. The reason why these games were hard is that they lacked save states and had many traps in the game, such as bottomless pits that instantly killed the player. The lack of save states and traps made the game seem longer to complete than it actually was, which gave the player the illusion that they made a worthy purchase. In addition, they In addition, because the consoles were mass-produced, they did not have the hardware quality of arcade cabinets, and the controls were often clunky, which added to the difficulty of playability. The first console era that is most familiar to me is the previous generation consoles. According to a blog from Academy Art, previous generation consoles were around the 1990s to 2010s. Instead of the traditional level-based games in the previous games, they were more story-driven and had save states. For example, a well-known story-driven game around this time is the Metal Gear Solid franchise. The difficulty of the game is based on stealth, but also allows the player to save at different checkpoints, so that if a player failed a mission or died, they can just start over at the most recent save state. Game consoles were also able to render 3D graphics, and 3D games in turn was the next step in the gaming industry. This allowed developers to introduce new difficulty mechanics, such as requiring the player to dodge the enemy or a combination of different attacks to defeat an enemy faster. Overall, the difficulty in video games did not become easier or harder, but rather new mechanics were added to further enhance the gameplay for the player. Today, modern and next generation games compared to the first consoles and arcade games show that the video games have come a long way in terms of what developers have to offer and the evolution of difficulty. As games can take on a larger capacity, open world games have become more common, allowing the player to explore more while following a general story instead of a linear model. Many games require an online connection, mostly for online gaming, as well as continuously updating the game so developers can fix and or add more content to the game. This in turn gave rise to the popularity of selling downloadable content or DLC to players in order to even further profit off gamers. Developers believe that players want more content in the game and stop trying to innovate new ways of trying to add difficulty to the game. For example, a game like Monster Hunter is not necessarily a difficult video game, as the player has a large amount of health and the player is able to easily restore health. The dodging and attacking mechanics were of moderate difficulty and more or less punishing depending on the weapon used. However, what makes this game artificially harder is that the player was required to grind the same monster or monsters over again in order to gather enough materials to purchase new equipment to defeat the next monster and progress further into the game. Most games, mainly AAA titles, are made for both PC and console gaming. However, because most people have access to a PC over a console, indie games have been on a rise over the recent years, appealing to a variety of players, especially those who game on a PC. According to indiegamingwebsite.com, an indie game is an independently funded video game, without the publisher to back them up. Since indie developers are not under a AAA company, nor funded by a publisher, they are often able to be more creative in developing new mechanics to video games compared to modern AAA games that focus more on profiting over innovative mechanics. Examples of popular indie games are Binding of Isaac, Super Meat Boy, Undertale, and much more. What many indie games share in common is that they feel nostalgic, as most of them functionally play like first-generation console games and arcade games, but with the added mechanics in modern gaming. Indie game difficulty is similar to older video games, but when a save state is added, it allows the player to try over and over again without the dread of putting another quarter in or the clunky controls that physically make the game harder to play. As mentioned before, video games have started to turn to online gaming, and there has been a demand and more investment in developing multiplayer games. According to an article written by Fabian Fischer on Medium.com, play against the computer AI and winning against them over time repetitively will soon become really boring. Therefore, players today try to compete against each other in order to maintain a difficulty level in a video game. Rather than trying to master a game mechanic, the player finds difficulty in improving on a skill to play better than the other player they compete against. Fisher explains this as, reaching a high rank will satisfy a player's will to power. Winning in the game asserts superiority by discipline. It is a natural human behavior and psychology to try to become better than a player, which is what makes competitive gaming that popular today. Therefore, multiplayer competitive games, unlike traditional single-player games, do not have a set difficulty, but are rather adaptive in the difficulty depending on the different skill levels of their players. However, when a player is losing and has no composure to it, the consequences of it lead to toxicity, such as being offensive or intentionally losing the game. Speedrunning, or watching speedruns, has been rising in popularity ever since the early days of gaming. Speedrunning is the challenge of trying to complete a game as quickly as humanly possible, or admiring how a computer is able to complete a game faster than humanly possible. Although this is the traditional way of speedrunning, different members of the community have made up creative ways in trying to complete parts of a game or achieving an objective as quickly as possible. Almost all of the games developed up until now have a category in speedrunning, but most players try to speedrun the games that come from the first consoles. The difficulty in speedrunning is not the game itself, as speedrunners have mastered their respective game and go beyond by defining difficulty as trying to outcompete each other in finishing a game or objective as fast as possible. Therefore, since speedrunning is constantly evolving as players find new loopholes or ways to find shortcuts in a game, it brings the gaming community together as well as indirectly assisting game developers in figuring out unintentional bugs in games. Finally, to apply all this information, I will be talking about Elden Ring along with my friend as a guest speaker. Elden Ring is part of the Dark Souls franchise, and it is well known for its very difficult gameplay. Both new and veteran Souls players are subjected to die multiple times in order to learn the enemy attack patterns. What makes Elden Ring and other Souls games so difficult is that there's only one difficulty, a lack of a tutorial, and the player is punished for trying to cheat their way through a boss fight, such as rushing a boss by tanking and recovering with potions. However, once a player is able to master the mechanics of the game and defeat an enemy, it feels very rewarding. I looked up an article from Ars Technica that breaks down Elden Ring into 5 different difficulties, which are mechanical difficulty, punishing difficulty, accessibility, grindable difficulty, and difficulty walls. While going over these different types of difficulties, I will interview my friend who has spent a fair amount of hours in the game on his opinion of these difficulties. Alright, so the way Ars Technica explains mechanical difficulty is that it requires different combinations of inputs within a small timing window. This is used in most early arcade games and consoles, especially fighting games, where directional inputs played a key role in executing combos to defeat an enemy. Fortunately, in Elden Ring, mechanical difficulty does not play a huge role as the controls are very simple and don't require any additional input other than a push of a button. However, the difficulty lies in trying to use these controls to try to output as much damage onto the enemy as possible without receiving much damage or any at all. So Matt, after how Ars Technica explains mechanical difficulty, what are your experiences with the mechanics of Elden Ring?
So I'm a new player to the Souls franchise, and I've never experienced like mechanics like this before until I played Elden Ring. And when it came to the tutorial, it seemed really easy at first, but once you get into the real experience of the game, they really test you of knowing and remembering these inputs, trying to make you master them from the beginning. Also, even though like all you're doing is essentially like attacking and blocking, like etc. The various combinations of these inputs is what the game expects the player to understand and utilize throughout their journey.
Oh, I see what you mean by this, and that the mechanical difficulty is pretty low at the beginning, but the game requires you to adapt more as you progress further into the game.
Yes, I would agree.
So moving on to punishing difficulty, Ars Technica claims that the punishing difficulty is pretty high and that many players alike would agree. The article explains that when a player dies every time, they will lose all the runes or the in-game currency, and when the player gets hit by the enemy, a large portion of their health will be taken away. There are also a couple of treasure traps scattered across the map that punishes the player if they try to open it. Overall, I think that this game wants players to learn from all the punished actions in order to successfully advance to the next parts of the game. So Matt, how often do you get punished in the game, and what can you do to overcome it?
I'm not going to lie to you. I've made many mistakes throughout like places I've been, like the tombs and bosses, etc. But it almost seems essential to me to die in the game so that I can learn from the mistakes I've made, so that I'm able to backtrack and create a situation of learning and memorization to be able to progress. When it comes to enemies in my playthrough, it almost always seems necessary to read or predict the movements of the enemy to make the right move and to be able to also progress in the game.
So yeah, it would seem that although the game is very punishing, learning from your mistakes and adapting over time can be rewarding. Therefore, unlike traditional games where dying can be frustrating, the player may not feel as bad because dying and getting punished is one of the main aspects of the game. Alright, the next type of difficulty that Ars Technica describes in Elden Ring is arcane difficulty. Arcane means something that is understood by a few, which in this case means that it is more accessible to veteran Souls players. This is true that in that Elden Ring lacks a full tutorial and pretty much puts the player in the starting map to try to figure out everything before exploring more difficult areas. However, I think that arcane difficulty is not too big of an issue nowadays because there are a lot of outside resources such as wiki pages and fan pages that explain every mechanic, controls, or even locations in the game. These resources, although it may be subjectively thought as cheating or spoiling, helps the game feel more accessible to new players overall. So Matt, you mentioned that you're a new player to the Souls franchise. What was your experience like when you first played the game? Was it easy to pick up or did you need to look up outside resources?
On my first day, I really had no idea what I was doing. Even though I thought the tutorial was helpful, I realized very early on that this game has high expectations of the players themselves to overcome many of the obstacles ahead, instead of having the developers to hold their hand. In many cases, I've needed extra help and I've had to look up lots of information, and I feel that the spread of knowledge between players is what makes the game more fun and interesting.
Yeah, I agree that games in general require the community to come together in order to preserve the popularity and demand of a game. During the release of the game, there have been so many videos and tutorials on the internet on how to defeat different bosses, which I am sure most of the players are appreciative of. If there were no wikis or fan pages then perhaps games would lose their hype faster. Elden Ring and other games alike in the modern days require the player to grind for new weapons and items in order to become more powerful or even match the level of the enemy. In Elden Ring, there is a leveling system that allows the player to gradually increase their character stats, as well as collecting and saving runes for the next weapon or armor. In some cases, an intimidating tree sentinel boss is presented at the starting area or near the player. From Software discourages the player to fight this boss at first hand due to the player having weak weapons and armor. However, the developers want to encourage the player to explore the map more and slowly upgrade their equipment so that they can return back and defeat an enemy. I haven't played a lot of Elden Ring, but do you think that the game wants the player to grind for equipment in order to progress further in the game?
I feel that minor enemies and their drops are really not helpful in giving items or anything that helps with equipment or experience points for characters while in the game. Also, it seems that it's a gamble to see if an item from a boss will be a blessing or a hindrance for the rest of the gear that they have, or for anything to help them in the game for the future. For the most part, Elden Ring gives risk-reward types of situations that the player must endure. It may or may not be worth it to risk their lives or time in-game when fighting opponents in certain areas.
Yeah, that really makes the game more difficult because although the game requires you to defeat enemies to get further into the game, it is more than just grinding but also managing where you explore in order to maximize the efficiency of your game progression. Finally, the final difficulty of Elden Ring that Ars Technica describes is the difficulty checkpoints or roadblocks. As mentioned previously, the starting player encounters a tree sentinel at the beginning of the game, which may look like a huge roadblock in the game as it is very hard to defeat with a given starting equipment. Therefore, the developers encourage the player to try to explore around the area, possibly raiding small caves and dungeons, in order to level up the character and gain access to better weapons. This is much different than older Souls games, in which the game is overall linear and requires pure skill and concentration in order to defeat them. Matt, I am sure that you have encountered some roadblocks in the game. What do you do in order to overcome these difficulty walls?
An example I've had of a difficulty roadblock is that I've had a very hard time with the first major boss of the game. I realized over multiple attempts I was ill-equipped and inexperienced in this fight. I was essentially at a major disadvantage. To make sure I had the right stats to prepare for this fight again, I made sure to explore other areas that seemed more appropriate at the level of understanding I had for the game. Then, when I felt I was ready enough, I would use this first boss as a challenge for all I had to overcome beforehand to get to this point.
Yeah, I agree that exploration is a new important mechanic in Elden Ring, and it has helped draw in many new players into the Souls franchise. It is more accessible than the traditional linear Soul style, and I hope that From Software will continue to use open world as a way to develop future Souls games. Thank you very much for letting me interview you about your experiences, Matt, with Elden Ring and how its difficulty affected your accessibility in this game. Good luck in finishing Elden Ring.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for inviting me, Sam.
Overall, difficulty will continue to be a contributing factor in the accessibility of games, and it is up to the consumer player to decide whether it is worth it to buy the game or not. Accessibility is subjective, and different people approach games in a different way or background. From the first arcade games and consoles to the ever growing market of next generation consoles, the difficulty has not only evolved but also had innovative ways of adding more difficulty or fixing the difficulty of the game. For indie games, I hope that smaller developers will continue to come up with creative ways in presenting difficulties in their games, and the competitive multiplayer and speedrunning games will keep growing. Finally, the recent release of Elden Ring has proven to the gaming industry that even though a game is difficult, it can still be accessible to new players through learning from their own mistakes or receiving help from the online community. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and hopefully I was able to show you what difficulty has to do with the accessibility of video games. Here are the references that I used to research about game difficulty and accessibility.